She's a beast. If you make it through this video, I promise it'll only get easier. The name Staphylococcus aureus tells us a decent amount right up front. Staph and coccus come from the Greek meaning grape and granule, respectively. And this is because under the microscope, Staphylococci look like a bundle of grapes. Now, aureus is Latin, and it means golden. And this is because when it grows on blood agar, its colonies have a yellow or golden appearance to them. So we took this idea of it being a golden Staphylococcus, or golden staff, and we've called this scene the Golden Staff of Moses. I hope you enjoy it. Now I'll start by drawing this desert background. You'll notice I've gotten really fast at drawing. Yeah, you know, I guess it's just practice, what can I say? Anyway, here's Moses. He's carrying a very impressive golden staff, the Golden Staff of Staph Aureus. Notice his robes are violet. We did this because Staph Aureus is gram-positive. And gram-positives take up crystal violet stain in their thick cell wall and hold on to it even after the rinse and the addition of red safranin, so they appear violet under the microscope. We'll tend to use a lot of violets in the gram-positive videos, and likewise we'll use reds in the gram-negative videos. Let's keep talking about how exactly we can identify Staph aureus in the lab. So far we've gone over that they're gram-positive cocci, but so are strep. So how are you going to tell them apart besides their shape? The first test you'll use is a catalase test. Catalase converts hydrogen peroxide to water and is present in all Staphylococci but not strep. Since staph is catalase positive, we'll add this cat, standing for catalase. You'll notice you won't see a cat in the strep videos or any catalase negative videos. We've placed them right here, front and center, and we've even made them look cool and Egyptian looking so that you don't forget about them. So if it's gram-positive and catalase positive, we're pretty certain we're dealing with a staph. Now how do we know it's Staph aureus versus a different kind of staph? Well, first, Staph aureus has that nice golden color when plated, but alternatively you can run a coagulase test. Coagulase is an enzyme that converts fibrinogen to fibrin, and it's present in Staph aureus. Notice Moses is standing in front of the Red Sea, literally a sea colored red. It's red because it's supposed to remind you of blood, and his parting of the Red Sea is him actually coagulating it. So again, this will remind you that Staph aureus is coagulase positive. Another way to differentiate Staph aureus from other types of staph is that it's beta hemolytic. We'll have Moses carrying this bright red light bulb with a B inside of it. This is our symbol that we'll always use for a beta hemolysis. We've designed it to look like a red light bulb because when looking at a petri dish showing beta hemolysis, it looks kind of like a glowing halo of light on a red backdrop. We're trying to convey that here. The last way to know you're dealing with a Staph aureus is to plate it on mannitol salt agar. The salt selects for only Staphylococcus species, and you can also differentiate whether or not it can ferment mannitol. If it can ferment mannitol, as in the case of Staph aureus, it'll turn the agar yellow. If it can't, the agar will stay pink. So to represent its ability to ferment mannitol, we'll draw this tall man here behind him. Tall man, or if you flip those, man tall, mannitol. A little bit of a stretch, I know, but I think you've got it. And we'll have him wearing bright yellow clothes. To remember, the mannitol fermenters turn the agar bright yellow. Now let's turn our attention to this big letter A in Moses' staff. You may have smartly assumed that this staff stands for aureus, but you'd be wrong. It actually stands for protein A, and it's the main virulence factor for Staph aureus. So you should definitely know it, and even better, you should know how it works. Protein A is a component of the Staph aureus cell wall, and it can bind the Fc portion of immunoglobulins. To visually represent this, we'll show the A binding an antibody at the Fc region. By doing this, protein A prevents complement from binding the same region, working to prevent opsonization and phagocytosis. All of this better enables it to colonize its host. Which brings me to my next point. Staph aureus colonizes the nares, or opening of the nose. And how will we show this? Notice the sphinx back here is missing his nose. That's because we moved it right here. We're using it as our symbol for colonizing the nose. Now we're going to dive into the diseases caused by Staph aureus. The first grouping are the inflammatory diseases. First we'll have this guy walking the camel, and he's falling to his knees and coughing. As he does that, he's pulling the camel down to his knees too. First, let's talk about their coughing. Staph aureus causes pneumonia, and the x-ray is said to look like there's patchy infiltrate. So we'll draw this patchwork quilt on the camel and on the coughing man to remind you of these patchy infiltrates. More importantly, you should remember these icosahedron-shaped lamps hanging off of the camel. I actually got suckered into buying one of these in Morocco. But anyway, in our drawing, they're supposed to remind you of the icosahedron-shaped capsule of a virus. And we have these here because the pneumonia caused by Staph aureus is most commonly a secondary post-viral superinfection, or a bacterial infection that occurs after our immune system has been weakened by a viral infection. Next, let's talk about why we have them kneeling. Well, it's because we wanted to draw attention to their knees, so we'll even add bandages to the camel's knees. And this should tell you that they have joint problems. And in this case, it's from septic arthritis. Staph aureus is the most common cause of septic arthritis in adults. Staph aureus causes a range of skin infections like cellulitis, impetigo, furuncles, which are boils, or carbuncles, which are slightly larger boils, and abscesses. But on tests, they tend to stick more towards the really nasty abscesses. So we'll make these camels' humps covered with red cloth. And this way they look like some really large erythematous abscesses. Over here we have a camel getting spooked and running in a full camel sprint towards the edge of a cliff. This poor passenger is really freaking out, and rightly so. She's clutching her chest in fear. So this camel getting spooked out of nowhere and starting to sprint should make you think of a really rapid onset. It just happened out of nowhere, and all of a sudden you're at the edge of a cliff. We're using her clutching her chest and having the hearts all over the camel to signal heart problems, specifically endocarditis. So altogether, Staph aureus causes rapid onset or acute bacterial endocarditis. In question stems, you should be thinking about Staph aureus endocarditis in someone that's an IV drug user. And in these cases, it's generally a right-sided heart infection, especially in the tricuspid valve. So first, to remember IV drug users, rather than drawing her and the camel shooting up somewhere in a bathroom stall, we'll stick to something more appropriate for this era, and we'll draw a mortar and pestle with these weird medication vials. These drugs will remind you of IV drug use. To remind you that tricuspid is the most commonly affected valve, we'll draw these three, or tri-pyramids lined up directly behind her. Staph aureus is also the most common cause of osteomyelitis in adults, so we'll add some fish bones here. Fish bones left out in the sun like this would be really rancid and smelly, which should clue you into some sort of infection of the bone. It'll be the symbol we always use for osteomyelitis, but this time we'll add two, because Staph aureus is the most common cause of osteomyelitis. Now I'll talk about the toxin-mediated diseases caused by Staph aureus. The first is called scalded skin syndrome. We'll draw this bald gentleman with his turban off, just roasting in the sun, getting really sunburned, or you could say his skin is getting scalded. And just like a sunburn, in scalded skin syndrome, your skin will begin to peel off. This is all mediated by exfoliative toxin, a protease. The next toxigenic disease is toxic shock syndrome. The classic situation for toxic shock syndrome is someone leaving some sort of foreign packing in for too long, like a gauze after a rhinoplasty, or a tampon. The toxin is called toxic shock syndrome toxin, or TSST, and it's a superantigen, which causes non-specific binding of MHC class II and T-cell receptors. This causes overactivation and eventual cytokine storm, which could be potentially fatal. To remind you of superantigen and shock, we'll draw on a cape, this super cape, with a lightning bolt for shock. We'll use this in another video to represent toxic shock syndrome. For the last toxin, we'll draw another running camel, but this time the woman on it is clutching her mouth and looking green as if she just threw up in her mouth a little bit. She has food poisoning, and the running camel signifies rapid onset. It's a rapid onset food poisoning because the toxin is preformed, so as soon as it's ingested, it can start causing symptoms within 1 to 8 hours. Unlike most food poisonings we learn about, Staph aureus food poisoning is more associated with vomiting than diarrhea. This is why we have her look like she's going to vomit. The food poisoning comes from meats and cream-based foods like mayonnaise or custards that are left out for too long. So we'll draw some meats and what looks like to be a jar of mayonnaise, which clearly are without adequate refrigeration. So now this next part may not be biblically accurate, but in our story, the Pharaoh comes out, raises his hand, and shows the Israelites mercy. This gesture of mercy will stand for MRSA, or methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. MRSA becomes resistant methicillin by altering its penicillin-binding proteins, or PBP. So PBP in Staph aureus helps construct the cell walls. In this story, the Israelite slaves used to be responsible for constructing the cell walls, but now that they've left, the Pharaoh resorts to using these altered pyramid-building people, the Anubis, or a jackal-headed god. Think of these altered humans building the pyramids, and you should remember that MRSA acquires its resistance to penicillin by altering its penicillin-binding proteins. Now for the treatment of MRSA, we use vancomycin. Our symbol for vancomycin throughout the course will be a van. But to keep with this era, instead of using a van, we'll use a caravan. But we'll still have it shaped to look like our vancomycin van that you'll see in our future drawings. Finally, if the Staph aureus infection is determined to be methicillin sensitive, then you should treat it with an appropriate penicillin because this will actually work more effectively in killing the bug than vanco. A good choice for methicillin sensitive Staph aureus is a penicillin called nafcillin. We'll change this Pharaoh's staph into a pencil. Pencils are a symbol for penicillin, and a good mnemonic people use is NAF for